The sun did come out for 30 seconds. Well, it was in the 30 seconds that I went from the third down to the first to grab a drink, and by the time I came out, the sun was gone.
This is our 4 seasons in a day.
Oh, in a day. Okay. I'm glad you clarified that.
That was 4 days in a season.
Okay. You want to get started?
No, that's
Yeah.
All right, welcome everybody. I believe we have our note takers already in the notepad. Thank you very much. Hopefully this is not your first IETF of the week, but as a reminder, this is the note well that applies to all of the discussions here. So please note it well. Do we have the brief version, the code of conduct slide?
No,
Yes.
sorry, I do the full version.
Oh, the full version.
Well, not full. I mean, you've got the code of conduct.
But yes, brief reminder for participants, please respect your colleagues here and no personal attacks. And yeah, I think that about sums it up.
We've not had an issue here. And
We're not supposed to say that.
Oh.
If you, yeah,
we're good.
we're good.
We're good.
Thank you. Great. So we have note takers. Is anybody willing to watch the chat? I have it here too. I will try to keep an eye on it. But if anybody is watching the chat and wants to make sure we don't miss something, feel free to just flag us down.
I will update the materials. So my bad.
Oh, that's the wrong link.
It's got rats because I copied it from rats.
Great.
We're on to the agenda.
Yeah, onto the agenda. So if anybody has any other items to add to the agenda, this is a good time to mention them now. Otherwise, we've got SCIM use cases from Pam and Paulo with a draft, and Elliot with device models. Yeah.
If we have time at the end, I can do the update since I'm showing you the cursor pagination.
Great. Let's add we probably will have time at the end, so let's add the cursor pagination update to the agenda. Anything else anybody wants to add? Okay.
So I approved a V2 version.
Yeah.
I think this morning. Is it possible to load that? It should already be there, but it was weird because it had a different V2 version. I didn't approve that one. So
Well, whichever one shows up, we will speak to. Yes. Hi, everybody. I am Pam Dingle, and we're going to talk about SCIM use cases. This is a draft that is not accepted by the working group, and we would like to change that. We either need to stop writing it or get it adopted. So we're hoping that you can be very opinionated about it, whether it has value. We uploaded a draft just before the deadline, so there is a new draft to look forward to. So let's get into it. All right, so the whole point of the use cases is to orient implementers to what the SCIM specification family can give you. So we're not creating anything new. What we're trying to do is encapsulate it so that the point of view of the implementer is forward, if you will. So these are the basics of the SCIM protocol that we try to outline in the draft. First of all, we do give names that are different from the protocol or that are in addition to the protocol to help you step back and look at not just one functional SCIM connection, which is what the protocols outline, but sort of the 50-foot view where you might have multiple SCIM connections all orchestrated together. So the SCIM protocol has objects and attributes, but we are specifically talking about a resource object and a resource attribute so that you can differentiate between resources. So as you can see, you've got essentially a resource type that gets defined, such as users, groups, and devices. And that is, there's an extensibility model for more objects that can be defined. And that every single one of those resource types, it has essentially a REST, a set of REST verbs that you can apply to it: post, patch, delete, and so on. So the whole idea of this is a CRUD API for the types of resources that are defined in the specification or extended in the specification. So a resource object would be, for example, a user or a group. And a resource attribute would be the types of claims that sit inside that object, like first name or last name or group member. Those are what resource attributes are. You want to get to the next one? And so because we're trying to take that step back from the protocol to give the implementer point of view, we've also defined orchestrator roles. So not only are you trying to have a SCIM connection, you're trying to move data from place to place. And so what that means, it gets created in one resource or one domain, and it gets moved between domains, and often between many domains. And so what you see here is potentially multiple SCIM actions that are taking place. So that is the goal of the use cases, is to talk about those SCIM actions in aggregate and not compared to the protocol, which is all about how do you actually construct a SCIM action, right? An actual SCIM server and SCIM client that can interact. All right, next one. So one of the things, so all of these are terms now from the specification. You've got provisioning, domains, triggers, right? And then SCIM actions. So in this case, you have a SCIM client and a SCIM server. Now that SCIM client and SCIM server could be in either orientation. You could be trying to receive data with a SCIM client, or you could be trying to push data with a SCIM client. So knowing whether you're playing the role of a client or the role of a SCIM server is not enough to define how your interaction sits in an overall orchestration of SCIM. And so what we do, what Paolo's going to talk about for the rest of this is basically where the yellow dotted line is the implementer's point of view. So in this case, I could be the implementer on the left, on the blue dotted line, or I could be the implementer on the right, or I could actually be in an orchestration role where I'm playing both roles, but I'm doing them in order, right? So it gets created, it gets pushed to me, and then I'm going to push it farther on, right? So in that case, I might play the role of SCIM server as things are pushed to me, and then I might turn around and immediately be a SCIM client to continue pushing. So the whole idea of this is that these orchestrator roles you see here of resource creator and resource subscriber, they talk about the directionality of the data moving, not the actual REST implementation of whether you're a REST server or a REST client. So ultimately, there's kind of a matrix that you create, right? Are you SCIM server or SCIM client? Are you resource creator? Are you resource updater? Or are you a manager in the middle? And then what that dictates is how you can label that arrow as, and like I said, so the arrow here is not something that's in the spec, right? But are you pushing data, right, from a client to a server, or are you pulling data from a client to a server? If you want to go to the next one. So if you are pulling data, right, you are pulling from a SCIM client that is receiving data, and the triggers that trigger that interaction, that SCIM action to occur are different, right? So if you're a client who's pulling data to you, you're probably going to use a polling mechanism or a periodic update mechanism. Whereas if you're pushing, then you can use a SCIM event. You can use a delta, like there's a whole bunch of other things you can do. And so what we're trying to do is discuss those patterns and why implementers might choose the pattern they choose, right? So it's all about kind of the next level consequences of how you make your SCIM implementation. With that, I'll turn it over to you. You can actually, we've included it in the spec. If you want to just sort of head up to slide 11. We have some of the examples of all the permutations and combinations of these generic scenarios, right? Where the yellow boxes are always your implementer's point of view, but the different connotations of combinations of resource creator, resource manager, and resource consumer are discussed. So we won't drag you through it, but they are there.
And another thing, just to mention these couple of slides that you just saw, another thing that is important is that we try to differentiate. Since we are showing it for someone that is going to implement, that is going to do that implementation domain. We are trying to differentiate, even if it's the same thing in the end, we are trying to differentiate the single tenant from the multi-tenant part, right? Because there are different considerations that you need to do when it's a single tenant and multi-tenant. And that's why in all the previous slides, you have the ones for single tenant, for the multi-tenant, and then using the different actions, the pull and push, to get that information. And that has implications in the client. So while we consider these first 3 use cases, we call it a generic use case that can be used in any kind of environment that we already have today or that we can have in the future. But then what we want to focus in the next slides is in specific implementations that we already saw or we saw that are being worked on from the SCIM community perspective. If we go to the next one. This one is the next one, sorry. And now we go to those specific ones. The first one that we are going to have in the next slide is about what Elliot is going to speak after, right? So we are talking about devices, and we have some kind of vendor that has devices, a manufacturer that sells device to a specific customer, and then those devices are going to need to be provision from the manufacturer. I know what are my devices, the manufacturer is providing me that information, and then that is going to be created in the customer, in their SCIM servers. And that can be done through a push, or it can be through a pull. So there, sometimes the customer domain, the SCIM server, is behind a network where you cannot reach, right? And in that case, you need to get a pull from the manufacturing. And that is something that I don't think it's described in the draft that you are presenting after, but can be a possibility for those kind of use cases where the client it's behind a network that cannot be reached. In the next slide, we have another example, also a little bit that was between our conversation with Elliot and the different devices, is about customer attributes, right? So whenever you have a device, when you are enrolling that device, you are going to create specific characteristics in that device, right? And you do that through some kind of commissioning tool that is going to provide those information. That information needs to go to that device management, the SCIM server. That can be done normally through a client app, some kind of service that is going to get that information either using Bluetooth, Zigbee, Thread, whatever protocols to get that information, and then there's an active push to the server. A possibility also is that that client app and commissioning tool be all together in a single environment and they do an active push directly. 2 kind of scenarios that might be used in this case for devices. If we go to the next slide, another use case that we saw that is interesting is that when that device needs to have information about other devices, right? So the device manager have information about all the devices using the 2 previous mechanisms that we already described. Now they need to do a pull, they need to push that information to the other devices. So they either do it directly to that SCIM client, that is that client app, that then through non-SCIM make it to the commissioning tool that then provision to device, or if you have a SCIM client that can receive that information and then do the commission through the commissioning tool, push it to the device, that is another possibility. The final use case for devices, in the next slide, it's when you need to push specific things like credentials, right? Credentials and certificates and things like that, that you have it in the device manager, that you push it to the client app, that then can push to the commissioning tool using normally non-SCIM operations. These are the 4 use cases that we discussed with Elliot and the rest of the team that is working on device, that we think that it makes sense. Only the first one is in the draft that Elliot is going to present, but we think that there are these also use cases that could be useful if you use SCIM to achieve those goals. The next one is a little bit different, is when you have an application, a provisioning domain, when you have an application, a homegrown app that does not have the SCIM capability, right? Cannot implement the full SCIM client stack where you have all the deltas and the things that need to be updated. Sometimes it's just an active pool that you just push all the information using the SCIM actions that are already defined in the other RFCs. And it's a very simple client app that just gets that information from a SCIM server. We can see alternative ways of doing that through non-SCIM, using direct database updates or proprietary connections to achieve the same, but that does not mean that we cannot have a very basic SCIM client that can do the same and does not follow all those different recommendations that we normally have see in a SCIM client. Okay. Next one, it's in an interesting use case that we see a lot. So imagine that now the resource attributes are not created from the same source. So the resource creator and updater create most of the attributes, but then there are specific attributes that are coming from the customer. So a simple example of that, let's say that you have an HR application that creates Paulo, first name, last name, home address, so on, so on, so on. But then the email address is created by a separate application, right? And the email address, today, you have proprietary ways of updating that resource attribute, or you have manual process that is done by the administrator. But think about it. Why shouldn't that client app, for instance, the email server, update that thing? And then we see the two different implementations that can happen there. That client app, that server, the email server, can either be SCIM server and SCIM client at the same time, and they will be SCIM, they will receive an active push from the client, normally the IDM, for all the attributes that comes from someone that creates that record, but they will be the client for those specific attributes. Okay? And this is one of the options. The other option is that we don't change the roles of SCIM client and SCIM server, but we have different actions, right? We have the push for the regular attributes, and we have the pull, and this we can also do the active pull and delta pull. We discriminate because Angeli also described in one of the drafts before that we can have these delta pulls that we do once the pull the first time, and then you just have deltas, right, for that specific attribute. And in this case, in option 2, we don't need to have both roles in the two different applications. Okay? Next one. Next one goes, and this is the last one, and there isn't that many questions or comments, so, but this is the last one that we have. It's very going to what Angeli did in that draft that was submitted before with the delta pools, that is about reconciliations. So let's think right now that you have an IDM that is going to push information to a SCIM server and is going to push all the records there, but for some reason the server did not take, did not implement, or they were lost in translation, and we don't know that happened. Right? So now the SCIM client is going to do active and delta pools all the time, saying that tell me what happens to Paulo, and if he sees that a record does not match what it should, then he do a push again to fix that situation. This way we have a reconciliation using these two mechanisms without needing to exchange rules. And this goes a lot to that draft that was presented by Angeli. That's it. So I think we finally were able, after a couple of IETF, a lot of them, finishing the writing, and we are happy with the text. Now we really need reviewers and more feedback. Maybe we are missing use cases, and that will be really useful to provide those implementers that never did it before. And we can have it. We have 10, we can have 12, we can have 15. What we really like to achieve with this is that we have a common way of describing things, because we have, in like 5 or 6 IETF meetings ago, we were in the table all together and trying to talk about the same things, and we could not find the right terms. We don't have the right terms to describe what we want to achieve. So the first objective of this use case is to find the terms so that everyone is talking the same language, and then giving some guidance to those people that are really new to SCIM to how this works without going to the details of the implementation that is covered by other RFCs. That's it.
Elliot? You should probably stay up here, Paulo.
Okay, so, right. First, thanks for writing and updating and developing the draft. A couple of things you didn't say that I think are worth saying. First, this draft is much more than just use cases, right? Even though the draft name has use cases in it, and if people open it up, you don't get to use cases until section 4. And the stuff that's in section 3 and 2 and 1 is all about sort of the SCIM architecture. And I think it does a pretty nice job of describing it. So there's a lot of value in the draft. The second thing I want to add is that as many use cases as you have enumerated, probably you could add, take that number of use cases and put a superscript number on top of it in terms of the number of possible use cases. So these are what I think are well envisioned use cases. But the nice thing about in fact, the fact that you have so many use cases, what it demonstrates is that SCIM is actually doing a pretty good job in expanding its capabilities, right? And so that begs, I think, two changes I would suggest to make clear. The first, I think, is that it would behoove you to reference RFC 5218, which talks about wild success, because I don't know whether you're at the wild success point, but there's definitely success, and we're sort of stretching the protocol. And Dave Thaler spent a lot of time with Bernardo Boba on that draft, and it's a really good draft. I think just referencing that you are beginning to stretch the use cases beyond perhaps what people initially envisioned. And I think that's a good idea. The second thing I would suggest is that you note that there may be other use cases that you haven't enumerated, right? Make it very clear up front that this is these are not the definitive list of all use cases, right? The way that the IETF, a good IETF document, a good protocol, a good architecture is built out of building blocks, and people use them as they will and as they wish to. So I think you've demonstrated that that can be done in a number of different ways. There are many other ways. And as long as this is also made clear, it's non-normative. These are here. This is informational. Looks like a great draft, and I would support adoption of this draft by the working group. And if the working group decides not to work on it, I would still not give up on it. I think there are other homes for it.
Thank you.
Thank
No
you.
I'll have
takes.
to recognize you.
I put myself in the queue, chair hat off, enterprise hat on. I didn't see like the simple use case of just enterprise IDP provisioning users into a application. This seemed to go pretty quickly into the more advanced. Is it in there and it wasn't mentioned in the slides? Is that
It was intentional.
it was intentional?
Yeah.
It's supposed to be
Let's-
why we need it.
No, we have the slides.
Yeah, this is the subject of big debate, actually, because the concept of an enterprise last mile is one of the use cases, right? Which is basically you've got an enterprise infrastructure, you have an app that's a line of business app that's not necessarily SCIM enabled. So the question is that I would ask this group if they have opinions is, do we only talk about the SCIM hop, or do we talk about the fact that there are other things that are possible? And we do have that section in the document, right? But a lot of the enterprise world, actually, there's integrations, there's connectors, right? They go to either to
Let
like
me
Tomcat or to,
let me back up a step though. I guess the question's more: is this supposed to describe what SCIM is currently being used for,
Yeah.
or
So
future?
if you go to use case 1, and we jumped through it because we presented it before, right? So use case 1 to 3 are the basic ones that we already present in previous IETF meetings, right? And we jump through all of this because we have 15 minutes and we don't have enough time, right? So SCIM client, that is the source that is going to create a resource in SCIM subscriber. All of that are described in use case 1 to 3, and those are the basic and generic use cases that are implemented today, and other possibilities. So what we also describe is alternative ways to do the same using, for instance, pool that is not so much used today, but could be used for things like when you have the SCIM client behind a firewall or things like that. So
No, thanks. This answers my question.
Okay.
This wasn't,
But
we skipped through this one in the
we
presentation.
jumped
Right.
because we did it
Yeah.
before, right?
But I do think there's one other thing that we could do, which is describe enterprise use of SCIM, right? In the sort of the more business side of the use cases, because that I don't think we do. So we can take that on board and then see if we can put something behind it and then talk to you whether that solves it.
Yeah, I think including that is fine. Just you don't have to be exhaustive, Pam. It's all in the context of the relevance of SCIM. Right. That's chair guidance.
Note taken.
Okay, Mike, you'll be the last on the queue. I'm just looking at the time.
No, I was just going to echo kind of what Elliot said. I think the terms you use, I've always loved better than the original SCIM stuff. I think it's much more explanatory. I think that anything, I'm also in favor of brief enterprise description, because anything that supports adoption and promotes this is the way you do it, as opposed to one-off connectors, I'm all for. Just because I think the more we can push that, the better off we'll all be. And I'd love to review it and work on it, especially in the SCIM events thing, because that's developing quickly as well. So thanks for including that.
We include the events also in the triggers. So those are the triggers and are also there. So that is also included. We didn't found the specific use case, but we would like to work with you to have those use cases, because we were debating what are the use cases based on the trigger, the draft for events, but we could not find a good example. But it would be great if we have 1 or 2 examples on that.
Okay, so as chair, I'm just going to cut, sorry, Mike, from a time perspective. Let me just do the quick question. How many people have reviewed this draft? Not the authors. So we have 2 people. Okay. Do you want to do a quick poll? So the first question that I want to ask is, do you agree that, is there interest in adoption for this draft? So we can then ask for reviews and do the call for adoption. No, it's a poll so that we capture those that are remote. Okay, we'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, it's pretty unanimous. What's that? For no opinion, but we do have relative consensus for a yes. So my next question is, would you like to see this? It would be an informational draft. I do see the value given that you have a lot of the preamble of the architecture. So from that standpoint, I could see this being an informational architecture draft with example use cases, just so that we don't continue to spend forever in enumerating the use cases. Meaning we could stop with the list as we have it as examples, and we can move forward. Do you think we need a poll for that? Okay. Well, that's why I prefaced it with, we could spin forever, which is what happened in other working groups. And that's why I'm suggesting if we purpose it as an architecture with sample use cases, we can cut the timeline so that we could publish it. All right. So given that there are really only two, I don't know, then should we do reviews or could we? After the, okay, so we'll take the action and we'll do a working group adoption call after this week. Well, we do expect not just a yes, but some feedback. So I'll pose the questions so that it's not just a simple yes. Okay, so thank you, Pam and Paula. Good work. Took a while, but good work. All right, so next up we have Elliot.
Okay, I think this might be the fourth or fifth or sixth time, something like that, that we've talked about the device draft. Each time I've just presented a delta from what's happened, but also with a little bit. We did. I'm going to get there. But just to remind people, next slide. So this is what the SCIM device model is. It's actually the core device model is really slim. It really creates the device endpoint and just one or two other objects. It's extremely slim. And the idea is that you extend to describe the device a bit more. And the examples are really, we have in there already our BLE connectivity, Zigbee connectivity, or Wi-Fi DPP, and we have a couple of others that actually this slide looks a little old because we already did FIDO device onboard, and we also added Ethernet MAB. So there are a few in there already. Let's see here. Next slide, please, because we'll just get to. That was just a bad cut and paste on my part. So what's happened since IETF 121? And just also to recap, everything we have open source for available, and we have at least one other implementation hanging out there somewhere. The initial security review was done. Mike Owensworth did that. He told me a really funny story afterwards that I mentioned to Deb, and I should mention to Paul at some point. As in terms of the results of actually being thanked for a review. But he sort of tore me to shreds on how we had certificates described in the draft. That was one of those moments where I definitely felt like saying, thank you, sir, may I have another? Because he did such a great job on the review. We did the update based on that, and he's provided positive feedback since. We got an IoT directorate review, and then we went through working group last call. During working group last call, we received a number of comments, some from Cisco, some from people at Philips. Lars Struzeban in particular provided a lot of detailed comments about largely textual changes that were non-normative. So the model didn't change really based on what he said, but he did catch a couple of errors in the tables that in terms of there was inconsistency between the tables and the descriptions. And so we fixed all that. And that left us with just two issues. Next slide, please. What? Whoa. This is the wrong deck. Okay, no wonder that looked, or something happened. Well, I'll tell you what the two issues are. Next slide, maybe. Is it beyond this? Yes. Okay. So I don't know where that slide came from. Anyway, so one of the issues is that we have this notion of a client endpoint that can be provisioned so that clients can actually communicate with for BLE and Zigbee and other things. They can actually communicate and establish control channels, and the clients can identify themselves using a certificate. And so one of the things we say in the draft is one can either use a subject or a subject alternative name. If you use the subject alternative name, the subject is to be ignored, and the subject alternative name is to be in the form of a DNS name, which raised a question, which is, if we have that text in there, should we then validate should we then validate like the reverse IP address, do a reverse lookup and map and confirm that indeed that subject, that DNS name is in fact being the one that you are speaking to. So that's a question, and I would just take guidance from this from people who know more about certificates and connectivity from me. And Paul's looking like, huh? So if you have thoughts on this, if you're not using a subject alternative name and you're just sticking something in the subject, we can't do that because there's nothing really to grab onto. But this would be sort of an upgraded security mechanism that you could use if it's there, to say, hey, only listen to, make sure you're at least looking at the IP address and the mapped DNS name. So it's some we have to answer that question. And anybody who has comments, we're welcome. I don't have a particularly strong opinion about it. I could go one way or the other. I'm slightly leaning to yes, please validate. If you're gonna go to the level of use that name, then maybe you should in fact validate the DNS name as the client peer. Next slide, please. The second issue is to just do a quick review on objects that are mandatory and what is optional. And really, this is about one object in particular. One of the objects we have this notion of a telemetry endpoint that's tied to BLE and Zigbee communications. And the issue is that there are some implementations that do not do telemetry. So here's the situation. You have an enterprise infrastructure. You have a device that wants to just sort of do BLE indications and notifications, for instance, and just basically blat out their announcements. And you have a client application somewhere that's trying to pick these up. And for that to work, you need this telemetry endpoint to find. So some BLE devices don't need this. Some do need this, right? And I think the key thing is that as far as the request to make this optional is concerned, from an enterprise infrastructure standpoint, if the enterprise doesn't support it, the client application receiving that is expecting to receive this telemetry information must be made aware at provisioning time that is not supported in this environment. They need to get an error. They can't just have the thing provisioned and then assume that they're going to get the telemetry and then it just doesn't show up. So that is something that we need to clarify in the text. And so the proposed resolution is to signal that with the classic sort of 200 response, where we return the object that was provisioned, but to make clear that the telemetry endpoint information is not there, and that is the signal to the client, to the SCIM client, that no, this wasn't supported. I think that's in line with the SCIM, with sort of how SCIM would take it, but it's a little different from like the user usage, because users support whatever they support, right? We're wetware, right? So devices are a little different in this point, and this will require at least a little bit of discussion. And so these are the 2 points that were raised. I want to thank Rohit Mohan for raising both of these points during the last call. And that is really it. Everything else is sort of done, which brings me, I think, back to the previous slide. Was that, or yeah, that slide. So I think we have to have that discussion. Then we'll produce a new draft based on the results of that discussion. And then I think hopefully we're ready for Shepherd review. And that's it for me. Comments? Comments on those issues or anything else in the draft? Oh, one last thing I'll mention is that Monty and I are going to work on at least one extension document to using it'll be a new extension, which we can use one of the existing extensions actually in the draft as a model to go forward. So he wants to do something with X509 IDEV IDs for devices, and I think we can do something relatively quickly, and that will be follow-on work for this. Comments, questions? Is everybody tired? Long day at the office? All right, then I really am done.
I don't see anything. All right. All right, so we've got 20 minutes left.
So, is my proposed action okay?
Yes. So just let us know, the chairs. Well, I mean, we'll see it when you submit the draft, and then we can determine who shepherds or if we want to ask volunteers for shepherd. And I already reviewed it, so. All right. So I had added that I could provide the update to the cursor pagination. So Cisco has actually implemented a client version. The skimdev.io has a server sort of version. And so we've proven sort of interoperability, which is what I was looking for as the shepherd. So Anjali, I don't know if you're on the call, but this is to say, I'll double check with you, but I believe that the authors have addressed all of the comments. I was
Yes.
waiting, thanks. And I was waiting to make sure that there was some reference implementation. So I'll go ahead and finish the shepherd write-up. So
Great.
that's the update for that one. We should be ready to go. I don't know if you want to say anything on the SCIM events.
Yeah, on SCIM events, we had done the working group last call on the mailing list a little while ago, and after the first 2 weeks, we only had one person respond, but a little bit after that, we got some more responses, so I think that's fine now. So we'll move on that to do the shepherds right up now.
Yep, we'll let you bypass the queue for now, Mike. Go ahead.
Yeah, on SCIM events, I think that given that there is a shared signals interop going to take place in December with OpenID, I would expect that I'm hearing unofficially that there are multiple implementations of SCIM events that are imminent. So just a heads up on that as well.
Right. Well, I mean, okay, I guess I'll take my chair hat off. And speaking as a co-author, we did have a couple of implementations, Mike. Right. So I felt okay soliciting that. But yeah, I mean, if you will be at the Gartner Interop,
Like I will.
there will be some implementations there. So, okay. I think we can conclude unless there is any other business. Anybody? Anybody care to look up from their laptops? Yes? No? Going once? Going twice? All right. I think we are done. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to all the authors for their work and progress. This is one of the I was going to go to the room and just listen to you from there. Or do you want me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then I'll just go with you.
Okay, yeah.
And that way we can just, yeah, just see Cam.